The year was 1885, and the land held its breath. It was a territory of jagged rock and thirsty earth, where the sun baked the silence into the ground and the wind carried the ghosts of forgotten languages. This was the world Lonan inhabited, a world he had chosen because it was as broken and solitary as he was. He was a man caught between two currents, his father's white blood warring with the Apache blood of his mother, a conflict that had left him an outcast from the only people he had ever called his own. His tribe, the people, had exiled him years ago. It was not one single act, but the slow accretion of mistrust. He looked too much like the men who surveyed their land for railroads, his eyes a shade too light, his features a compromise that satisfied no one. They called him Inda-Wigai, the White Apache. A name that was not a description, but a verdict. So he had left before they could cast him out, taking his skill as a scout and tracker into a self-imposed exile, a quiet vanishing. He became a whisper in the canyons, a shadow on the mesas, a man who spoke more to his horse and the hawks than to any human. His life was a spare and disciplined ritual. He rose before the sun painted the eastern cliffs in hues of rose and ochre, his movements economical and silent. He hunted, not for sport, but for sustenance. He tanned the hides, mended his own worn buckskins, and read the story of the land in a way no one in the bustling, dusty towns could ever comprehend. A bent twig, a scuff in the sand, the flight pattern of a startled quail, these were his letters, his words, his only conversations. The grief of his rejection had settled deep in his bones, a permanent ache like an old wound that throbbed when the weather turned. It had hardened him, glazing his spirit with a stoic calm that few would ever dare to penetrate. He had built a small, defensible camp in a shallow box canyon, a place with a reliable seep of water and a single, narrow entrance he could watch from the high ground. It was not a home. A home was a place of belonging, of shared warmth and voices. This was merely a place to exist, a fortress against a world that had no space for him. He was a man hollowed out by loneliness, living a life of profound resignation, waiting for nothing in particular. It was on a day scorched by the late summer heat that the rhythm of his solitude was shattered. He was tracking a mountain lion that had grown too bold, its prints leading him north toward the old wagon trail, a route mostly abandoned for the safer passage closer to the forts. The air grew still, heavy with an unnatural silence. Even the insects seemed to have ceased their buzzing. Then he smelled it, the acrid stench of smoke, not from a clean campfire, but the greasy, foul smell of total destruction. He tethered his horse in a copse of mesquite and moved forward on foot, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky soil. He crested a low rise and saw the source. It was a single wagon, or what was left of it. It lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its canvas cover burned away to skeletal hoops of scorched wood. The ground around it was a chaotic mess of splintered crates, strewn clothing, and the dark, still shapes of the two draft horses, arrows bristling from their thick hides. Two human forms lay near the wreckage, a man and a woman, unmoving under the indifferent glare of the sun. It was the aftermath of a raid, swift and brutal. Lonan felt nothing. It was the way of this land. Violence was a part of its grammar. He observed with the detached eye of a scout, noting the unshod hoofprints of a dozen Poniesa raiding party, likely young men seeking status, not a formal war band. He was about to turn away, to retreat back into his isolated existence and let the desert reclaim its own, when he heard it. It was not a cry of pain or a shout of terror. It was a thin, wavering whimper, a sound so small and fragile it was nearly lost in the vastness. It was the sound of a life that refused to be extinguished. His body tensed. He scanned the scene again, his eyes moving past the tragedy to search for the source. The sound came again, slightly stronger this time, from within the overturned wagon bed, beneath a pile of singed blankets. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. This was not his concern. It was a white family's tragedy, and he was no part of their world. To involve himself was to invite complication, danger, and the very prejudice he had spent years avoiding. But the sound persisted. It was a hook in his conscience, pulling him forward against his will. He moved cautiously toward the wreckage, his rifle held ready, though he knew the raiders were long gone. He reached the wagon and peered into the shadowed interior. There, tucked inside a splintered wooden crate that had miraculously protected it from the worst of the chaos, was a baby. It was wrapped in a simple flannel cloth, its face red and blotchy from crying, its tiny fists balled up in distress. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its hair was a fluff of pale gold, and when it opened its eyes, they were the color of the sky just before a storm. A white child, the ultimate symbol of the world that had pushed him away. He stared down at the infant, a battle raging within him. He could walk away. In an hour, the sun or a coyote would finish what the raiders had started. No one would ever know. Or he could take it to the nearest settlement, a place like dusty Prescott, and leave it on the church steps. But that was a 2-day ride, and he knew how they would look at Half-Apache, or near enough, with a white baby. They would see a kidnapper, a murderer. They would ask questions he couldn't answer, and their judgment would be swift and merciless. The baby let out another cry, a raw, desperate plea for life. In that sound, Lonan heard an echo of his own profound isolation. This child was now as much of an outcast as he was parentless, tribeless, utterly alone in a hostile world. He reached down, his calloused, scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted the small, warm bundle from the wreckage. The baby, startled by the movement, went quiet, its wide, blue eyes fixing on his face with an unnerving intensity. In that moment, the wall Lonan had built around his heart developed its first crack. He had made his choice, or perhaps the choice had been made for him. He turned his back on the carnage and walked toward his horse, carrying the future in his arms. The first days were a clumsy dance of survival. Lonan, a man who could track a whisper on the wind and read the age of a footprint in hard-packed dirt, was utterly inept at caring for a human infant. The baby's cries were a language he did not understand, a constant, piercing signal of needs he could only guess at. Hunger, pain, loneliness. He tried offering it water from his canteen, which it choked on. He mashed up some cooked rabbit meat with jerky, a gesture of desperation that only made the crying louder. He felt a rising tide of frustration and despair. He had taken on this burden, and now he was failing it. He sat by his fire on the second night, the baby wailing in a makeshift cradle he had fashioned from a leather pannier. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a raw nerve in the vast, silent dark. Lonan felt the urge to scream with it, to match its helpless fury with his own. He was a fool. This was a mistake. But in the morning, guided by a half-remembered fragment of his mother's wisdom, he located a small herd of wild goats. It took him half a day of silent, patient stalking to isolate a nanny and her kid. With a skill born of necessity, he captured the nanny, a rangy, wild-eyed creature that fought him with every ounce of its strength. He tied her securely and, after a dozen failed attempts, managed to squeeze a thin stream of milk into a tin cup. He brought the cup to the baby, dipping his finger into the warm, musky liquid and touching it to the infant's lips. The crying stopped. A tiny, seeking mouth latched onto his finger, sucking with a surprising, desperate strength. Lonan held his breath, watching the small, fragile life drawing sustenance from his hand. He refilled his finger again and again, a slow, tedious process, until the baby's eyelids grew heavy and, with a final, contented sigh, it fell asleep. Lonan slumped back against a rock, exhausted but filled with a strange, fierce sense of triumph. He had kept it alive for another day. He looked at the sleeping child, its face peaceful in the dappled sunlight. He still saw it as a thing, a responsibility. He had yet to allow himself to see the person within the bundle. His interactions remained functional, guarded. He changed its soiled cloths, washed it with a damp rag, and held it only when necessary. He kept a deliberate distance, a space between his own wounded heart and this new, vulnerable one. He spent his days in a state of hypervigilance, watching, listening, assessing. The baby was a loud, fragile liability in a world where silence meant safety. Yet, as the days turned into a week, then two, a new rhythm began to establish itself. The frantic cries of the first days softened into more readable signals. Lonan learned the cry of hunger from the cry of discomfort. He learned that the baby sometimes just needed to be held, to feel the steady beat of another heart against its own. He found himself talking to it, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't speak English, the language of his father and the men in the towns. He spoke Apache, the words of his mother, the language of the earth and the sky. He told the baby about the hawk circling overhead, about the way the light changed on the canyon walls, about the stories hidden in the stars. The baby, of course, did not understand the words, but it seemed to respond to the low, steady cadence of his voice, gurgling and cooing in the quiet moments between his sentences. One afternoon, as Lonan sat mending a rein, the baby lay on a soft rabbit pelt nearby. It had been watching him, its blue eyes tracking his every movement. He glanced down, and for the first time, the baby's face broke into a wide, toothless smile. It was a moment of pure, uncalculated joy. It struck Lonan with the force of a physical blow, bypassing all his defenses and landing directly in the hollow space in his chest. He froze, the leather rein slipping from his grasp. He had not been smiled at in a decade. He had forgotten what it felt like. He slowly reached out a hand, and the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around his index finger, holding on with a grip that felt as strong as an anchor. In that small, simple connection, something shifted irrevocably inside him. This was no longer an it. This was a person, a boy, his boy. He needed a name, not a white man's name from the world that had created and then abandoned him. He needed a name that belonged to this new life they were forging together in the wilderness. He looked at the boy, his pale hair shining like corn silk in the sun, his spirit a small, bright flame that had refused to be put out. He thought of the light that follows a storm, the hope that comes after despair. Ashki, he whispered, the Navajo word for boy, feeling right on his tongue. It was simple, it was fundamental, but then he added another, a private name, an Apache name. Tsego, he said softly, he who survived. From that day forward, Lonan's purpose was no longer simply to endure, it was to protect. The boy, whom he began to think of as Isaac when he imagined the world beyond their canyon, became the center of his universe. He taught him not with words, but with actions. He showed him how to be quiet and watch the deer come to the seep to drink. He let him touch the rough bark of the cottonwood trees and the smooth, cool surface of river stones. He carved him a small wooden bird that he could hold in his hand. He made a new, more secure carrier for the boy, one he could strap to his own back, allowing them to move as one. He began exploring further from their canyon, always with Isaac nestled safely against him, a warm weight that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of his new, terrifyingly precious responsibility. The silence of his life had been broken, not just by the baby's cries and coos, but by the reawakening of his own heart. The loneliness was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer absolute. He had found a tribe of two, a small flicker of belonging in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. 2 years passed. The land shaped the boy as it had shaped Lonan. Isaacus Lonan now called him in his own thoughts, a bridge to a world he still kept at bay grew from a helpless infant into a sturdy toddler. His hair remained a shock of pale gold against his sun-darkened skin, and his eyes were still a startling blue, but he moved with a quiet confidence that was all Lonan's teaching. He knew the difference between the call of a canyon wren and a pinyon jay. He could walk barefoot on the rocky ground without flinching. He knew which berries were safe to eat and which plants would sting his fingers. His first word was not da, but a child's approximation of the Apache word for water. Their life in the box canyon was an idyll of isolation, a secret world they had built together. But Lonan knew it couldn't last. The world outside was encroaching. The glint of prospectors' pans was appearing in more streams, and the distant sounds of blasting for the railroad echoed through the mountains on still days. The sanctuary he had built was fragile, its walls made of nothing more than solitude and distance. The intrusion came, as he always knew it would, without warning. He had been teaching Isaac how to track a lizard in the sand near the mouth of their canyon when he heard the clatter of shod horses on stone. It was a sound that did not belong. He scooped Isaac into his arms in one fluid motion, pressing a hand gently over the boy's mouth and melting back into the shadows of the canyon wall. Two men rode into view. They were prospectors, by the look of them bearded, dusty, and carrying the weary, avaricious look of men who spent their lives chasing glimmers in the dirt. One was thick-set and rode with a slouch. The other was leaner, with a cruel twist to his mouth and cold, assessing eyes. His name, Lonan would later learn, was Callahan. "Told you there was water back in here," the stocky one said, his voice a gravelly intrusion in the quiet air. "Saw the green from the ridge." They dismounted, letting their horses drink from the seep. Callahan's gaze swept the canyon, his eyes sharp and practiced. They missed nothing. He saw the tidy camp, the neatly stacked firewood, the small tanned hide of a rabbit stretched on a frame. And then he saw the toy small wooden bird Lonan had carved, which Isaac had dropped in his haste. Callahan walked over and picked it up, turning it over in his grimy hands. "Well now, look at this. Someone's living here, and they got a kid." His eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows. An Injun, most likely. No white man would live this rough. Lonan's heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He held Isaac tighter, the boy's small body rigid against his own. He willed them to be invisible, to be nothing more than a part of the rock. "Come on out," Callahan shouted, his voice bouncing off the rock walls. "We ain't gonna hurt you, just want to water our horses." Lonan remained still, a statue carved from shadow. Silence was his best defense. But Isaac, frightened and confused, began to squirm, letting out a small, muffled whimper against his hand. It was enough. Callahan's head snapped in their direction. His eyes, accustomed to spotting the subtle signs of gold, fixed on the subtle disruption in the pattern of the shadows. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be. Got a shy one." He took a step forward. "And what's that you got with you? A papoose?" Slowly, knowing there was no other choice, Lonan stepped out from the shadows, positioning himself between the men and his son. He held Isaac behind him, shielding the boy from their view. He said nothing, his face an impassive mask. The two prospectors stared, their jaws slack with astonishment. They saw a man who defied their categories, the build and bearing of an Apache warrior, but with features that were an unsettling blend. And then Isaac peeked out from behind Lonan's leg, a small boy with a tumble of blonde hair and bright blue eyes. The stocky man's eyes went wide. "Sweet Lord, Callahan, that's a white kid." Callahan's smile vanished, replaced by a look of hard suspicion. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Where'd you get the boy, Injun?" he demanded, his hand moving to rest on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. Lonan's own hand instinctively tightened on the knife at his belt. He kept his voice low and even, speaking in the halting English he despised. "He is mine." Callahan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Yours? You steal him? Did you kill his folks? We heard about that wagon raid up north a couple years back. Was that you?" "He is my son," Lonan repeated, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He was stating a truth these men could never comprehend. Their world was built on lines of color and blood, lines he had spent his life being punished for crossing. "You're a liar," Callahan sneered, taking another step forward. "That boy ain't yours. He needs to be with his own kind. We'll take him into town, see he gets to a proper home." He saw it all in a flash, the hero's welcome, the reward. The story they could tell for years about how they rescued a white child from a savage half-breed. "You will not," Lonan said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmoving as the canyon walls around them. "We'll see about that," Callahan said, his hand now gripping his pistol. "Give us the boy, or we'll take him." Lonan knew this was a fight he couldn't win with force. There were two of them, both armed. His only chance was to use the land, the one ally he had ever had. He backed away slowly, pulling Isaac with him deeper into the canyon. "Leave," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "This is not your place." Callahan and his partner exchanged a look. They had the upper hand and they knew it. "We'll be back for him," Callahan promised, his voice full of chilling certainty. "Don't you worry about that. A boy like that belongs in a white world." They mounted their horses and rode out of the canyon, leaving a toxic silence in their wake. Lonan stood for a long time, listening until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely. He looked down at Isaac, who was staring up at him, his small face a mirror of confusion and fear. Lonan knelt and pulled him into a fierce embrace. The sanctuary was breached. The world had found them, and it was coming to tear them apart. That night, there was no peace. Lonan did not build a fire. He sat in the cold darkness, Isaac asleep in his arms, his senses stretched to their breaking point. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every rustle of a nocturnal animal like the cocking of a hammer. He knew Callahan would be back. Men like that were fueled by greed and a self-righteous cruelty that they mistook for justice. They would not simply ride away. He had to leave. This place, his home for 2 years, was no longer safe. But he couldn't just run. They would track him. He had to be smarter. He had to use their arrogance and their ignorance against them. He was a scout. He was a hunter. And tonight, he would be the prey that set its own traps. He spent the hours before dawn making his preparations. He packed their few essentials into a single leather bag: dried meat, the tin cup, a water skin, the rabbit pelt blanket. He worked silently, his movements precise and purposeful. He looked around the small camp, the only home Isaac had ever known, and a wave of cold anger washed over him. These men were trying to steal not just his son, but their entire world. Just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, he heard them. The distant, faint clink of a horseshoe on rock. They were coming, as he knew they would. He strapped Isaac securely to his back, whispering to him in Apache, his voice calm and reassuring, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Be still, my son. Be quiet as the stone. We are the wind now." He did not run for the mouth of the canyon. Instead, he began to climb. He moved toward the steep, treacherous back wall, a sheer face of rock that looked impassable. But Lonan knew its secrets. He knew every handhold, every narrow ledge, a path he had scouted long ago for just such an emergency. It was a goat's path, a spider's climb, a route no sane man would attempt, let alone with a child on his back. He was halfway up when Callahan and his partner rode into the canyon below, their rifles drawn. They stormed the empty camp, kicking over the cold fire pit, their voices echoing with curses when they found it deserted. "He's run for it," the stocky man yelled, pointing toward the canyon's mouth. "Let's go. He can't have gotten far with the kid." "Wait," Callahan commanded, his sharp eyes scanning the area. He was smarter than his partner. He saw the tracks leading away from the camp, but they were too obvious, too clear. A man like their quarry wouldn't be so careless. Callahan's gaze lifted, sweeping the canyon walls. From his perch high above, Lonan froze. He flattened himself against the rock, trying to merge with it, Isaac's small body pressed tight against him. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought Callahan had seen him. The prospector's gaze seemed to pass directly over their position, but the angle was steep, the morning light still deceptive. Callahan's eyes moved on. "He's playing games," Callahan snarled. "He's trying to trick us. Split up, you take the trail, I'll check the ridges." It was the mistake Lonan had been counting on. As the stocky man thundered out of the canyon, Callahan began to make his way up the more accessible slope opposite Lonan's position, hoping to get a better vantage point. Lonan waited, his patience absolute. He waited until Callahan was committed, high on the ridge and separated from his partner. Then Lonan continued his climb. He moved with a terrifying speed and silence, not upward, but sideways, traversing a narrow, crumbling ledge that led to a deep fissure in the rock face. He slipped inside, into the cool, dark belly of the mountain. From a small opening, he could watch Callahan on the opposite ridge, a small figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Now, he set his trap. He had gathered what he needed on his way up: loose stones, a length of rawhide cord, a dry, dead branch. He worked quickly, using his knowledge of leverage and balance. He found a large, precariously balanced boulder at the top of a steep scree slope that funneled down toward the path Callahan had taken. He anchored one end of his rawhide to the boulder and the other to the dead branch, jamming it into a crack in the rock. It was a simple trigger. A sharp pull on the branch would dislodge the boulder, starting a rock slide. It wasn't designed to kill, but to block, to terrify, to close the door behind him. He waited. He could hear Callahan shouting in frustration from the opposite ridge, unable to find any sign of them. He heard the partner ride back into the canyon, his voice echoing. "Nothing. He's vanished." "He's here somewhere," Callahan yelled back, his voice raw with fury. "He's an animal. He can't have just." It was time. Lonan took a deep breath. He looked down at Isaac, whose wide eyes were fixed on his. He saw not fear but trust, absolute trust. It gave him all the strength he needed. He moved back out onto the ledge and, with a powerful heave, pulled the trigger branch. There was a groan of stressed rock, then a tremendous crack. The boulder teetered for a second before plunging downward, striking the scree slope with immense force. It set off a chain reaction. A river of rock and gravel cascaded down the mountainside, a deafening roar that filled the canyon. It poured across the path below, a thundering, unstoppable avalanche of stone and dust. Callahan and his partner stared in horror as their only exit was sealed off by a massive, impassable wall of rubble. Dust filled the air, choking them. Their horses reared in terror. They were trapped. Lonan didn't wait to watch their reaction. He slipped away, moving along the high, hidden ledges of the canyon, putting distance between his family and the men who would destroy it. He did not look back. He had not killed them. He had simply used the mountain to protect its own. He had met their violence not with more violence, but with the wisdom of the earth itself. He moved through the wilderness like a ghost, carrying his son, his purpose, his entire world on his back, leaving the foiled hatred of men buried in a tomb of their own making. They traveled for weeks, moving north and west, into the high country where the air was thin and clean, and the world of men was a distant rumor. Lonan walked the ancient paths, his senses alive, teaching Isaac the whole way. He showed him how the aspen leaves trembled in the wind, how to find water by following the line of willows, how to listen to the language of the pines. They finally found their new home in a place that seemed to have been waiting for them. It was a small, hidden valley, cradled by towering granite peaks and fed by a spring that ran clear and cold all year round. A thick stand of pine and fir trees offered protection from the wind and prying eyes, and the valley floor was a lush meadow, rich with game and wild berries. It was a place of deep peace, a world away from the harsh, baked earth they had left behind. Here, they built a new life. Lonan constructed a small, sturdy cabin, not a temporary camp, but a real home, with a stone fireplace and a solid roof against the snows he knew would come. Isaac, now a boy of almost 3, helped in his own way, carrying small branches and handing his father tools, his face alight with the serious purpose of a child at work. The harsh, guarded silence that had defined Lonan for so long was gone, replaced by the sounds of their shared existence. The chop of his axe, the crackle of the fire, and above all, Isaac's laughter, a sound that filled the valley like birdsong. Lonan's Apache words were now answered by the boy's own attempts, a blend of languages that was uniquely theirs. One evening, as the sky bruised into a deep twilight and the first stars appeared like diamond dust, they sat before their home. Lonan was showing Isaac how to fashion a simple flute from a river reed. Isaac watched, his blue eyes intent, before taking the finished flute and producing a single, soft, breathy note. He looked up at Lonan and smiled, the same pure, unvarnished smile that had first broken through his father's defenses 2 years before. "Nata," Isaac said, his small hand resting on Lonan's arm. "My father." Lonan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so profound it almost hurt. He looked at this boy, this child of a different blood, a different people, who had been abandoned by one world and saved by another. He had not stolen a child, he had been given one. The tribe that had exiled him, the world that had judged him, none of it mattered anymore. His identity was not defined by his mixed blood or by those who had rejected him. It was forged here, in this hidden valley, in his bond with this boy. He had been a man between worlds, belonging to none, but in rescuing Isaac, he had rescued himself. He had found his purpose not in vengeance or bitterness, but in creation. He had created a family. He had created a home. He had looked into the face of prejudice and despair and chosen to build a life founded on love and protection. He put his arm around his son, and together they watched the stars multiply, two solitary figures who had found their entire universe in each other, a tribe of two, finally and truly home.